Chris Johnson here of Zarin PT and Endurance Coaching, speaking live with Brad Beer on the Physical Performance Show.
Failure is not an option.
I've had my ups and my downs.
I think it's an absolutely breakthrough experience.
Welcome to the Physical Performance Show, the show designed to inspire the pursuit of your physical best performance. I'm your host, Brad Beer. Listen in as we delve into how the world's top physical performers achieve their success, as well as the highs, the lows, and the journey of getting there. Let's get ready, set, let's go. Welcome back, or welcome to the Physical Performance Show, brought to you by Fasciitis Fighter and Pogo Physio. I'm Brad Beer, sports physiotherapist by trade and training, and founder of Pogo Physio. Each week, we'll aim to bring you the latest and greatest inspiration and information designed to help you perform at your own physical best. We do this across a range of different episodes, including our interest editions, expert editions, featured performer episodes, and also Coach's Corners. And on today's episode 184, we explore a very important topic for the endurance athlete, and that is all things bone stress injuries. That's right, this is an expert edition, and it will be a double header, where next week, today's guest combines with another authority in the space to bring you 2 weeks of back-to-back exploration of the assessment, diagnosis, and management of one of the most common sports medicine conundrums, bone stress injuries in athletes. With bone stress injuries, and that is stress reactions and stress fractures, and in some instances, complete fractures representing 10% of all sports medicine injuries, it's most likely that you yourself have incurred one, or you know one of your training colleagues who has. So it's high time we put the expert edition hat on and we jumped into this topic. And today's guest is none other than Chris Johnson. Chris is a highly regarded and esteemed physical therapist based in the US in Seattle. Chris himself is an avid endurance triathlete, a 2-time Kona Hawaii Ironman qualifier, and a certified triathlon coach. Chris is also extensively published in the medical literature and has a monthly column on Ironman. In addition to that, Chris has a fantastic YouTube channel and is the co-host of The Runner's Zone, a great podcast on all things clinical for practitioners and runners alike. And it's this great mix of personal endurance-based sports and knowledge and his distinct gift for treating the endurance athlete and runner that made Chris a fitting guest to explore this expert edition on all things bone stress injuries. So here is my conversation, an expert edition on all things bone stress injuries. We'll be discussing the diagnosis and assessment of them, concepts such as hitting peak bone mass through the developmental years, discussing how and why runners, including myself, succumb at times to runners' stupidity syndrome, as Chris puts it, why it's important to tinker with only one variable at a time with return to run programs, debunking some common myths around bones and running and loading, and I also share a little regarding my own challenge with bone stress injuries over the years. So here is my conversation with Chris Johnson, US-based physical therapist, on this, an expert edition. Chris Johnson, this has been something I've been looking forwards to for a long time. As a fellow practitioner, you're someone that I've taken a lot of inspiration, I guess I would say, from, in terms of being a clinician that doesn't rest on their laurels, that's always turning rocks over, looking underneath them, even if the discovery is ugly, and constantly pursuing new knowledge and trying to translate that to help the people that we signed up to help in the first place. And that's the people with injuries who are out there, trying to perform at their best and get back to doing the things that they love. So Chris, thank you for joining us.
It's an honor to be here, Brad. And, it's always so flattering to have folks who are, at the other end of the world reach out to me, and the fact that they're even aware of anything that I'm doing from a professional standpoint. So, and I feel like this will be a great conversation because we're at very similar points in our lives as well as our professional careers, and we both have a keen interest in endurance sports.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And Chris, to paint a bit of perspective around your current professional life and your personal life, can you take us there and then fill in the gaps of how you worked through to this current state?
Well, I've always been a pretty active person, dabbling in all sorts of sports, and I think when I was younger, there are a few ecosystem-related things that I didn't have a good control over, mainly rest, recovery, and nutrition. And I would just go from one sport to the next. I mean, my summer days would be 10 hours long. I would play tennis. I would be riding my BMX bike, rollerblading, to soccer. And I never would sit still. And I would be eating gummy worms. It was like nutrition. It was just, to say the stage was set for trouble is an understatement. So I ended up getting into some issues as far as being an overhead athlete. I was pitching baseball at a young age. And I think I was working beyond the capacity of my body and just started to get some pushback. And I would say that first happened when I was around probably 10 or 12 years old. And I didn't realize it at that time, but that's really when the path down the physical therapy realm was kicked into motion. And I was introduced to a lot of these exercises that I continue to tinker with. And I had a whole slew of injuries and surgeries. And I never thought I would go into physical therapy, but I was always very fascinated by the process. I love the fact that the people who were working with me really took the time to get to know me. They helped me develop and broaden my identity. And it wasn't just, hey, you do this strength exercise and range of motion exercise. I mean, that was part of it. But it was this weird sort of amalgamation of things, and I would get back to sport at a higher level and would also have greater confidence in my body and met some great people along the way. So long story short, I had transferred to a school in Boston to study finance, and I remember sitting in class in a financial accounting class, and I'm like, you have got to be kidding me. What the hell am I doing here? I'm gonna shoot myself. And I made the decision to go back to University of Delaware, where I'd started my undergraduate studies, having no clue that they just happened to have one of the top physical therapy programs in the world. And, I was knocking on some of the professors' door, talk about like just, leaving no stone unturned. And sure enough, I knocked on Lynn Snyder-Mackler's door. I'm like, hey, it looks like you do research, and I have plenty of time to help. And she said, yeah, I'd love to have you as part of our team, and we'll keep you busy. And from there, things just fell into motion. So
that was the early seeds. And then your current world, Chris, you're a practicing physiotherapist there in the US, and you also have, some great online stuff going on, the Runner Zone podcast with your colleague Nathan. So what does a week look like in the life of Chris Johnson at the moment? You're also a father of, I believe, 2 children?
Yeah, a convoluted mess. So I'm in the midst of racing season right now, and somehow I'm getting it done. But this morning, in all honesty, I woke up and I was a little bit hungover. I worked myself into an oblivion. I'm sitting there and I'm drinking beer, like anything that's in front of me, food, beverages, alcohol, it's going to go down. And then I sort of lose track of things. And I'm like, oh man, it's 10 o'clock. I need to go to sleep. And then I sleep poorly. And so today was sort of trial by fire. So I saw a couple of patients today. I was working on that project that I had alluded to at the beginning of the call, just to help clinicians refine their decision making in terms of physical performance tests, with helping runners get back to consistent and healthy training. And I squeezed a bike rider in on the Wahoo Kicker, and I'll have an open water swim tonight before it gets too dark.
As you say, you're in the middle of racing season. One of the things I think that I appreciate about yourself as a clinician, Chris, is that you walk the talk, you're seeing athletes, endurance athletes, and you're also one yourself. So what's your next event, Chris?
I usually keep this on the down low, but so I raced. Well, I did Ski to Sea this year, which was a relay, a really funky race. But I had the 8-mile downhill run at a 5.5% grade. I don't know why I did that, because a week after I ended up racing Victoria half Ironman. And I somehow finished the race, ended up, having a decent result, and then raced Coeur d'Alene 70.3 2 weeks ago, I guess now, which I don't really toot my horn that much, but I bring this up because we're both masters level athletes, and I was really excited because I had my fastest run off the bike at age 41. And I think it's a reminder that you can still make gains as you get older. And I think you become a little bit more calculated with your training, and it takes a while to build the engine. But so to answer your question, I'll race Ironman Canada in 2.5 weeks, which is a punishing course. It's 8,000 plus feet of climbing on the bike, and it could be very warm. It could be freezing cold. That happened in 2015. It could be smoky, who knows? But I didn't get a chance to race that last year because I was in a horrific cycling accident in the late winter, early spring on a family trip to Hawaii. And I'm lucky to be alive, but got into an accident and my clavicle, needless to say, ended up in 2 pieces. So fortunately, Ironman lets you basically delay for a year, and then at that point, if you don't race, the money's theirs. So. But yeah, it'll be a challenge, needless to say.
Well, I'm surprised as we record this, Chris, you're not sitting on the Wahoo kicker again, knocking out some more Ks and recording at the same time. But well, look, you mentioned a fractured clavicle. That is not the fractured clavicle yours, but that's the essence of today's conversation. Bone health for, I guess, endurance athletes, runners. Managing the bone stress injuries in particular. Obviously, you had a fracture, which I believe required surgical management, right?
I always encourage people, if you can skate through this through conservative management, I would really encourage you to do it. I had a little bit of a tricky situation because I was supposed to do a few international trips where I was going to be presenting, and we have 2 little ones, so I couldn't risk this going on to a non-union and then have to go through like bone grafting procedures. So I said, look, I'm just going to get this thing fixed. I had it done in Hawaii. People thought I was crazy, but there's competent surgeons, in many places of the world. But the problem was that the plate, and I don't fault the doc for this, but it was left hanging into my AC joint a little bit. So it created like a little bit of a ledge. And I didn't do any swimming for about 9 to 10 months because I was concerned anytime I would go into full flexion that I would probably start to, create a little bit of premature wear on that AC joint. And we know anyone who's been an avid sportsman over the course of their life that AC joint ends up, obviously being a hot spot.
We spoke briefly before we pushed play on the recording, and one of the things I think would be useful today is to use me as a case study, as someone that's had 20 years of endurance activity and some bone stress challenges over the years. But before we put that into practice, you assessing me, if you like, running through the things that you would in practice do, and that'll be good for the listeners of this show to be aware of if they are themselves recovering from a bone stress injury. Before we go there, let's paint the scene in terms of, we'll set the scene, how much of a challenge this is for endurance athletes. Epidemiologically, 10% of all injuries in sports medicine clinics are reported to be bone stress injuries. Between 1/3 and 2/3, it's been reported of runners have a history of this. Chris, in your practice and observations over the years, how big of a problem is this for endurance athletes, bone stress injuries?
Well, I always, Nathan and I both joke, and you mentioned Nathan. He's a good friend and colleague who is in Kansas City, Missouri. And, we always joke and say, look, if someone claims to be an expert in working with endurance athletes, what they're really telling you is that they have that they're proficient or they've developed some sort of expertise in managing tendon-related disorders and bone stress injuries. because that's what we see.
Yep.
And if someone is not saying that, they're probably not working with a lot of endurance athletes.
Yeah, what a great little summary. So they are the primary concerns of endurance athletes. Chris, when I refer to bone stress injury, what's your definition of it?
Inadequate rest between subsequent stresses involving the bone. So we were talking to say, bone is not static. And I think people think of bones as these are these rigid levers and they are what they are. And they're dynamic, all right? And there's a lot of factors that can influence them. So I just chalk it up to say inadequate rest between subsequent stresses.
Inadequate rest between subsequent stresses. And the subsequent stresses, Chris, being, in the case of an endurance athlete, training sessions.
Yeah, essentially.
Chris, in terms of what's known about risk factors for an athlete, let's say a runner, triathlete, developing a bone stress injury, how would you best summarise what's known around risk factors?
Well, I would say that we've learned a lot thanks to a number of researchers, but I think that you have to break this down, and obviously a lot of females are a focal point when we're starting to talk about risk factors. So if you have, say, a female who has delayed menarche, so it's hitting at 15 years of age or older, if they don't have a good relationship with food or reduced energy availability, that would be a risk factor. Not participating in axial loaded sports, primarily during the Tanner stages 2 through 4, so really like 11 to 15, 10 to 15. And obviously if they have a history of a bone stress injury, that is going to significantly increase the risk of sustaining another one. And that's one of the questions you have to ask. If someone, presents with a bone stress injury, say, hey, have you ever had a bone stress injury before? And specifically in the region that you're currently dealing with one.
So that past history of prior bone stress injuries is important. And as you mentioned, an athlete's activity levels through their developmental years. Chris, certainly since I've had to work through my own bone stress injuries in recent years, with my children, I've taken a distinct interest in how am I going to help them augment or help maximise their peak bone mass as they develop. So can you share some thoughts and ideas from your end there, Chris, around, you've got young children as well, the things that you think are important for parents to consider with their children in terms of their activity status as they go through adolescence? I
think to expose them to variable forms of loading and high impact loading especially. I think it's when you're young that it can be that much more forgiving. I think if you take a master's level athlete, say 40s, 50s, and you start trying to hit them with a lot of heavy plyometric training, you have to be really careful because they may end up sustaining a muscle strain or a tendon-related disorder. So, I think that if you look at basketball players, so like my background, I used to play a lot of soccer, direct, dynamic, variable loading. I used to play a lot of tennis, abrupt starting, stopping, changes of direction, jumping. And I would run, but it would typically be it would be short but intense runs. I think soccer is a great example. It's like you have these bursts of speed if you're making a run to the near post or the far post. So again, bone also seems to behave in a manner where you need to stoke it a little bit, and then you need to afford it rest. So what do I mean by that? So, giving someone, say pogo jumps, giving them, say, maybe 20 to upwards of 50, no more, pogo jumps would be a great stimulus. And you could do that a couple times a day. It's like, hey, go out and have recess a couple times a day. That's how we should be approaching this. But to realize that there's I hate this phrase, but it's relevant here, a window of opportunity where you can really push the needle. And that has to take place early.
What don't you like about that phrase, Chris, the window of opportunity?
Well, I think it's used in manual therapy. So that's, I don't want to confuse it. I think if we're discussing bone health, and when you want to expose these individuals to high impact activities, it's when they're young. It's amazing. I don't know if this musician is even aware of it, but the front man for the band that used to be called the Presidents of the United States, he has gotten into children's songs, and he has a song that's called Stompy the Bear. And it's amazing because when you go to his concerts in Seattle, he's a Seattleite, plug this in, you'll crack up. You'll think I'm crazy, and then you'll watch it. And it's like basically it's a bone loading protocol. And basically all these kids are like stomping the floor with their foot, and they do it for maybe like 20 to 30 times. And then the chorus chimes in, and then they repeat it. So I think stuff like that is great. So kids just need to be encouraged to play. And I think that in and of itself, and I don't think sports specialization, especially with endurance sports, is great at that age. I think, give them the freedom and encouragement to go and dabble in whatever they want.
And just to clarify, Chris, you said at that age, you meaning, to put years around it, between 10 and 15 or? Yeah,
I would say it's going to be a little bit different between boys and girls. But
yep.
I think targeting, let's just say, if we give it a little bit of a broader range, 8 or 9 to 15. And you see this with weightlifters. You see this with, I was a overhand athlete, being a tennis and baseball player. I mean, if you look at Rafael Nadal or Federer, their bone density is going to be greater in their dominant arm.
And it's ironic that you're sharing these learnings from your professional career, Chris, with a guy, myself, who dropped tennis at 10 or 11 to go flat full stick at triathlon, and many years later have had quite a few bone challenges with some genetic component, but still it's interesting all the same. Chris,
and you may have been okay. We don't know. You may have been okay had there not been, and I don't know all the details, but so yeah, I mean, there are people who do this and get away with it, and the question is, we have to understand them just as much as the people who go on to develop issues.
Yeah, no, good point. Chris, this concept of peak bone mass, you use that phrase, the window of opportunity, and with regards to our bone health, it is very real. We do have that opportunity to try and, I guess, set ourselves up well to then steward the bone health that we've created in those early years across our lifespan, irrespective of activities we pursue. From your knowledge, Chris, this concept of peak bone mass, is that something that, obviously you're willing to develop in athlete, but how far do you explore that in clinical practice?
It depends on how long I'm going to be working with someone, at what point they start to engage me. It's tricky, and I think that especially if you have a younger athlete, you need to engage the parents. You need to engage the coaches. I mean, it takes a village to handle, to really set the stage properly.
Yeah, it's I think I commented with yourself, Chris, before we push record. I feel I manage bone stress injuries as a physiotherapist better now. However, the more I look at it, the more I realise, and these are the words of yourself and your colleague Nathan on the Runner's Zone podcast, bone stress injuries are difficult and messy in terms of management.
They are, and you have to have incredible communication lines with the athlete. And the same goes for tendon-related disorders. And I think that having a conversation about pain is such a critical first step, because I'm comfortable with, provided that the tendon's not reacting or in a reactive state, but I'm comfortable with people poking into pain, as someone like Greg Lehman would say, when it comes to tendon-related disorders, provided that they're not on Cipro or something like that. But I think with bone stress injuries, I don't think we definitively know, but my clinical instinct is to be a little bit more conservative. I don't want people having pain that's sort of like, Tobleroning a little bit. I really want to make sure that we get them to a point where they're able to get through activities of daily living first and foremost before we start exploring any more advanced exercises or activities, especially if we're dealing with a high-risk bone stress injury site. So, for listeners, when we talk about high risk, femoral neck, the anterior tibial cortex, the navicular, the base of the fifth metatarsal. And it scares me how haphazard certain clinicians and physicians are in working with runners in particular, because a lot of times runners just get dismissed. They're like, oh, this person's crazy. All they want to do is run. But I think it's also worth mentioning that tendon-related disorders and bone stress injuries also have pretty distinct and different presentations. If someone's pointing to or like pinching their Achilles, you're not thinking, hey, this person may have a posterior medial tibial stress fracture, and then you talk to them about their symptomatology and, how things have been behaving. It shouldn't be a mystery to diagnose these or to triage people. And this is one instance where I am so reluctant to send folks to a doc, especially if they're an endurance athlete, because, as I just mentioned, they often get dismissed. But if you're suspicious of someone having a bone stress injury, I tell that client or patient, I say, I want you to look at me dead square in my eyes and follow my advice here. Is there anything that you do not understand from what I'm suggesting or recommending in terms of next steps? Not something to play around with, because you could have a running-related injury that goes on to become a life-altering injury. And if that happens, I mean, shame on both parties involved.
Oh, gosh, Chris, I'm so pleased you shared that. I am often shocked is probably the best descriptive by missed diagnoses of bone stress injuries in endurance athletes. And I just think as clinicians, anyone working with a cohort like that has to have a high index of suspicion that if the description of the onset of symptoms, as you say, it's distinct from something like a tendon, then it should be sitting high on the radar. And as you say, Chris, look me in the eyes, there's no wriggle room to get this wrong. Can you just clarify, though, for folks listening in, what you meant by this could be a running-related injury that becomes a life-altering injury? Can you paint a bit more of a picture around that?
Yeah, I think of a woman who recently consulted me. She works with a running coach who is on a different continent, and which is a task unto itself. I mean, talk about the importance of communication lines. But this woman said, look, I'm getting a lot of pushback. I have this, sort of circumferential mid-thigh pain, and when I go to run, it just gets progressively worse. And when I hear something like that as a clinician, especially at this point in my career, my antenna go up right off the bat. And now this woman didn't have a low body mass index. She had no prior history of a bone stress injury. But when you hear complaints like that, you have a professional obligation to tell that person that, look, not only you're not racing this. It's not like, hey, I don't think you are not racing. And if you race this weekend, do not, it's almost, you want to tell the person, like, do not call me and follow up and tell me that you're in a bad state, because, and I think you have to be very nuanced in how you have this conversation. I said, look, if you're my sister, all right, I would be going to that race and preventing you from running if you're thinking of having a go at it. I said, you have a husband, you have children, you cannot play around with this, because the burden falls on them. And not only are you going to have to probably go through a surgery to address this, it'd probably have to do an ORIF, but now you're going to not only be sidelined for several months, but now you're also going to have to appreciate the fact that the burden's going to fall on your spouse and your children. So it's just, these are really, bone stress injuries are not something to play with, especially with high risk sites.
And I think it feeds back to your comment, Chris, that bone is dynamic. It is not a static entity. And I mean, I graduated thinking bone was static, even though we had one of the world's leading mind, professors, if you like, on bone health as part of our faculty here on the Gold Coast. And I still graduated with I knew it was dynamic and it could be remodeled, but it wasn't until a few years into my practice that I actually started to, I guess, grasp that, you know what, there's strain going through these bones. And I heard recently, I think your colleague Nathan may have even posted something along the lines that the load through a tibia with running can be anywhere from 6 to 14 times body weight. So there is not a lot of wriggle room to get things wrong or to play it casual.
Yeah, 100%.
Chris, in terms of diagnosing the bone stress injury, though, before we talk about assessing them, what are the gold standard ways to diagnose a bone stress injury?
MR.
Yep, MRI.
Yeah, and sometimes people may get CT scans, but I always tell folks, I'm like, if you have a bone stress injury that's presenting on X-ray, a lot of times you'll send these folks to a doc, and they'll say, hey, I got an X-ray. I'm thinking, no, that's not the goal. That's not what we had discussed. Not that I want to tell a doc how to do his or her job, but if it's presenting on X-ray, it's probably a full-blown fracture. All right. And I have a case, remind me to bring this up, that's just wild along these lines. But so, yeah, you want to get an MR if you're suspicious of a bone stress injury. And like I said, some docs may order a CT scan if an MR is inconclusive. And the tricky thing, too, is there was a study where they showed that roughly 43% of collegiate runners show a bone stress reaction on MR. And they did not go on to develop a bone stress injury when they followed them over 2 years. So, when you go to a race, a lot of these folks who are running right around you very well may have a bone stress injury, but for whatever reason, it's not symptomatic. So that adds another layer of complexity in. What is it? Why is that not leading to pain or dysfunction?
And why do you think it might not be leading to pain or dysfunction? Just a normal adaptation of the bone to the strain, the load rates, or what would be your insight into it, Chris? Or they just haven't pushed it hard enough yet to make it symptomatic?
Maybe that they are just walking a razor blade in terms of basically load and then recovery. And maybe it's something that does become symptomatic if, say, they have a week where they're getting poor sleep. Maybe they're dealing with the stress of final exams. It just goes to show how complex this stuff is.
Say someone has the MR findings of a bone stress reaction. How much stock, Chris, as a clinician, as a physical therapist, do you place in the grading of that? Grade 1 to say obviously a 4 is a fully frank fracture through something like the Fredrickson scale. Do you take much stock in that, or you don't look at that too deeply?
Well, I think you make a note of it, just because the more information you're privy to, you want to make sure that you at least document it and that's in your mind. But one of the things that I often see is I want to know from a symptomatology standpoint, and Bruce Wilk came up with a classification system that I think he would have further refined. He has since passed, unfortunately. But what I see very often is someone may have shin pain. They go to see a doc. They have an MR. It confirms a bone stress injury, and they're put in a cam walker. And we know that disuse is catabolic for bone and tendon. The interesting thing about that is they don't have symptoms outside of when they're running. They don't have symptoms when they're walking around. They don't have symptoms with activities of daily living. It's when they're exposed to impact that their symptoms surface. So I think the last thing you want to do with someone like that is to immobilize them in any way, shape, or form. Because if they're not having symptoms, I think that that's probably a safe amount of loading that they're exposing their body to. And some of these folks can even get away with doing some strength work. So again, I think you have to really make sure you pinpoint where that person is, and to make sure that, again, you maintain open communication lines.
Yeah, there's that C word again, communication. Chris, before we do dive into some assessment items here, you mentioned there's a wild story about someone, I believe, that maybe was sent for plain film imaging or x-rays to pick up a potential bone injury. Can you share that before we miss the opportunity to...
Yeah, and this is wild. This guy had consulted me after the fact, but he was training for the New York City Marathon, and for some reason, I don't know who planted the seed in his head, but he was doing the elliptical 5 to 6 days a week, and he was running 1 day a week. And this goes to show that you also need some shock and some load. And we can start getting into some of the recent articles that have been published on, the whole notion of vertical ground reaction force and, how that applies to things. But this guy ended up going, he ran the New York City Marathon, but developed a full-blown tibial fracture that they had to basically put plate and screws in. And so just as much as, we're trying to tell people, hey, maybe you need to dial it back if you're dealing with a bone stress injury, also underloading someone can be just as much of a problem in terms of tripping these off. So again, it's just having a really sound and sensible program while realizing that the target is always moving as a function of life primarily. Yeah,
I mean, it feeds back to your comment, obviously, about managing someone if they're not having pain with their, say, non-running or, impact loading activities, walking around. Is it really, unless it's a high-risk stress site like you've shared just prior there, Chris, is it really required that we put them in a boot and crutches? I mean, as you say, you're putting someone, in Tim Gabbett's terminology, into the basement, right? They've got a long way back.
Yeah, for sure.
So, Chris, before we talk at the assessment items, there's a few myths that I think just set the scene a little bit for the importance of this around, in particularly, running and bone health. It wasn't until I picked up that I had low bone health several years ago with a diagnosis at 36 of osteoporosis in my spine that I spent the time looking at some literature and really diving deep on it. I had always thought, and I'd told patients over the years, athletes, that, running's good for your bones. It helps to build bones. However, as I looked into it, I started to sort of realize that actually it doesn't necessarily build bone. It may help to maintain or maximize bone health, but it's not necessarily bone building, as opposed to something, jumping off a step awkwardly and, that really high force that can stimulate the bone. So can you share a little bit from your perspective, Chris, around this myth and where it's come from and why it continues to be perpetuated that, running's going to build bone?
Well, I think that the shock of running is probably a good thing. But what we know with bone is it needs to be, I use this, and I got this from Seth O'Neill when he was talking about, how you approach loading tendons. Bone and tendon, the cells come from the same lineage, so they need to be stoked. They need to have a pretty novel stimulus for them to react through this whole concept or through mechanotransduction. So again, I don't think running is necessarily a bad thing, but it also, the body habituates to it. So it no longer becomes this novel stimulus. And maybe it's as easy as just having someone who is typically doing all of their running on the road or treadmill to start incorporating some trail running, just because of the variable nature and the difference in the dynamics of loading. I think that's something that I honestly don't see a lot of bone stress injuries in the trail runners that I work with. I see ankle sprains, and they always get dismissed as like, hey, this is some trivial thing, and it's almost a rite of passage. So yeah, I think it's more the fact that, and I even have certain runners, I'll say, hey, if you're going to run on the road, every 10th minute, I want you to do 1 minute of serpentining, just to expose some variable loads into the bone. Or if you see a park bench, to run up and, jump up and down a couple times, provided, they don't have any risk factors for, rupturing their Achilles. So, yeah, I think sometimes we could make some really minor adjustments. There's an old school coach who's in Seattle here, and sometimes you'll go to their practices and you'll see a group of maybe like 6 to 8 runners, and they're just running in a circle, like a tight circle. And again, these are some simple strategies that are probably great for bone health and novel loading.
Gosh, I like that. So making the loading variable rather than just so, linear running up the road. And it's interesting, one of my femoral stress reactions, because I've had two, one recently and one preparing for the New York Marathon 4 years ago. And it was distinctly when I added a hard Friday morning trail run of about 10 kilometres in, and it was about 4 weeks into adding that in, and we were going for it, a group of runners, that I developed the first signs of my femoral stress reaction. So that's a great example of, my legs were used to maybe 80K a week of road running, and I threw in one hard trail session. It was enough to tip me over that fine line. Chris, one of the other things...
Do you think it would have tipped you? So you said a hard trail session. I mean, what happens if you just went out... I always think with runners, in endurance athletes in general, but running especially because it's very unforgiving from a programming standpoint, you just manipulate one variable at a time. And for a lot of the people I coach, they're always like, oh, your programming's so simple. I'm like, well, yeah, it's just because I'm tinkering with one thing at a time. If we're going to introduce hills, and hills are something that you don't spend a lot of time doing, we're going to start with short duration, but throw speed out the window. We'll do this off of RPE, or rating of perceived exertion.
So, yeah, you can't necessarily have it all as appealing as it may seem as an athlete.
Correct.
And you're right. I knew I was running that Friday morning session too hard, and it was... all shackles off. It was almost like a 10K time trial. So off the back of a hard fartlek the day before. So, I was aware of it, but as we often do, and I've heard you use this phrase, I succumbed to runner's stupidity syndrome and was forced to reflect on my practices when I couldn't run. So
it's always a great saying until it happens to you. And sometimes people have asked me, they're like, hey, what happened? I'm like, I was just being stupid. I
often joke that we're good at deceiving ourselves as runners. We can create a justification for any behaviour, even if we at our gut level know that it's inherently probably not in our best interests.
Exactly.
You're listening to Chris Johnson, US-based physical therapist, on this an expert edition on all things bone stress injuries for the endurance athlete. Today's episode is brought to you by Fasciitis Fighter. Strong feet are happy feet. The Fasciitis Fighter is a unique exercise device designed by an Australian physiotherapist, Hamish Vickerman, which replaces the hassle of the rolled-up towel in the evidence-based high-load strength training protocol for persistent plantar fasciopathy, or plantar fasciitis as it's commonly known. The Fasciitis Fighter is used by thousands of health practitioners around the world, as well as professional sporting teams, including teams in the AFL, NFL, and NBA, to name a few. The Fasciitis Fighter is fast becoming the go-to product in the management of plantar fasciitis. Find out more, visit fasciitisfighter.com.au or follow them on Instagram or Facebook with the handle @fasciitisfighter. Today's episode is also brought to you by Pogo Physio. We exist to help you get back to your physical best. We want everyone who walks through the doors of Pogo Physio to complete their rehabilitation, get back to their physical best, and in doing so, cross their physio finish line. We do not want to see you for a single session more than what you require, or a single session less. We just want to ensure you get back to your physical best and back doing the things that you love. To find out more about Pogo Physio's award-winning services, including our 1-hour initial appointment or our popular telehealth consultation online sessions, jump over to pogophysio.com.au. For now, let's jump back with this week's guest on this an expert edition around all things bone stress injuries for the endurance athlete with Chris Johnson, physical therapist. Chris, one of the other things that I've really resonated hearing you speak about recently, and it's been my observation over the years, is why is it that we see sometimes very high-profile, high-performing endurance athletes, say an Ironman triathlete, or a cyclist, have a fairly innocuous fall or accident and succumb to a bone fracture. And it's always fascinated me since I was aware of my own bone health status, that there must be a lot of endurance athletes out there, recreationally competitive, elite, that probably are getting around with low bone health. And then when they crash, which, as you shared, it tends to happen when you ride a bike for long enough, we often attribute the injuries to the forces alone. But what's your thinking on terms of the bone status of a lot of endurance athletes?
Well, I think that you have to look at the sport or sports. I think that, if you take folks like swimmers and cyclists, and I single those sports out because they're non-axial loaded sports. Those are the folks who, they seem to, I think back to a case when I was in New York City where this fellow who's probably 6'3" or 6'4", like tree trunk legs, but he's never really done much outside of cycling from a sport or recreational standpoint. And he came to see me, or actually called me one day and he said, look, I need to reach out and connect with you. I just had surgery on my femur. And I'm like, what the hell happened? And he said, well, I pulled up to a light and I was a little bit distracted and I went to unclip and couldn't get my cleat out of the pedal. And I fell and he sustained a femoral neck fracture, which is scary because, the concern of avascular necrosis. So fortunately, he's been doing okay. But I see this a lot, and I make it a point to talk to triathletes in particular if they tell me that they've come from a swimming background, because they seem to be a little bit more prone to developing bone stress injuries and sometimes even tendon-related disorders. I mean, that's anecdotal. But you definitely see these patterns.
I can absolutely relate from observation to what you just shared. The swimmers that transition over who haven't had that stimulus, as you shared before, in that window of opportunity with axial loading activities, my observation is they do tend to succumb to a lot more bone stress related pathology than those that aren't, 2 sessions a day in the pool.
Yeah. Well, and the saying goes, and I'm not sure if you've heard this before, but the swimmers always say thank God for the runners, and the runners always say thank God for the swimmers. I mean, swimmers are designed to basically get long and rotate around a longitudinal axis. Nothing related to exposing the bones to shock. So, as great as it is to come from a swimming background in terms of being a competitive triathlete, if you're doing that to the exclusion of, some form of good bone loading when you're younger, that probably sets a stage for trouble and could potentially be a risk factor.
And just a lengthened onboarding to the loads of running, which few athletes are excited about. That's one of the challenges I've seen is, myself included, we're not excited about taking years to build up our tolerance to a decent run program. We want it to happen in months.
Yeah, of course.
Chris, how do we want to approach this? Assessing someone with a bone stress injury. I'm happy to put my hand up as a case study, but I think what would be really rich is, what are the things that are important if someone's listening and they've got a bone stress injury or a suspected bone stress injury? What are the things that their practitioner would ideally be exploring with them?
Well, I think to really collect a detailed history, most of my consults are, I would say, like minimum 90 minutes. And I would say the first hour, if not more, is talking to that person, saying, hey, tell me what life was like growing up. What was your nutrition like? What sports were you playing? And to really delve into that, when did you start lifting weights? Who was overseeing your program? Really make sure that you collect a comprehensive past medical history. And I think that you have to be very careful of just, accepting all these responses. If you have a young female who you say, look, are you having consistent periods? And they say, yeah. I say, well, tell me about your schedule the last 4 to 6 months. You'll find out really quick if they're being truthful. So you can't just assume that all the information that's being provided is factual. So I think you have to really probe. And, if the parents are there, that can sometimes be helpful, can sometimes be a strike against you. But you also, if you're talking to them and you're like, well, tell me where you're experiencing symptoms, and they're like pointing, in the lower leg to a region of say if they're like pointing to the tibial shaft, or the navicular can be a tricky one because of posterior tib tendinopathy. So that's something that, again, in palpation and the tuning forks and all that, these are not great in isolation. But again, you want to make sure that you understand from a regional standpoint where they're having symptoms, and also how are the symptoms behaving. So with bone stress injuries, they tend to get worse with repetitive loading. All right. And it's important to note this because you want to contrast this with tendons, which often warm up. All right. So we call that the warm-up phenomenon. We have no clue why. All right. But that seems to be a pattern where people say, like, yeah, I was a little bit slow out of the gates, but once I settled in, like, things were pretty good. And then it was a little bit sore the next day, and I had some stiffness the following morning. People with bone stress injuries, as I just mentioned, their symptoms tend to get worse with repetitive loading. And when they cease impact, their symptoms tend to abate relatively quick early on. But if they keep sensitizing it, sometimes these symptoms can persist for a little bit longer. And at that point, you have to really just be on top of it. I can think of a great example where there was a young sprinter who was sent to me for a gait analysis. And this woman was super strong. I mean, she was off to college, full ride. And I saw her walking in, and she was tiptoeing on the involved side. And when I saw that, I said, that's weird. She's trying to shield something. Like, that's not normal. And whoever referred her to me for a treadmill analysis must have been asleep during the session, because, when I saw this woman, I'm like, oh, treadmill, and let's not even worry about that. And, she was complaining of these vague posterior thigh complaints. And the last time someone had a similar set of complaints, it turned out to be an osteosarcoma with someone who was diagnosed with a hamstring strain that couldn't recount a mechanism of injury or one particular incident. So again, I mentioned before, like, my antenna went up, antennae, I don't know. But long story short, you have to be really present with these people. And I always feel so bad for clinicians who are in these busy outpatient clinics, because you are going to miss critical details that you otherwise wouldn't if you weren't pressed or rushed.
Yeah, and I think therein lies part of the challenge for many practitioners who don't get to have sovereignty over their length of consultations, etc. I do 1 hour initial appointments. We have done for many years now, and I feel like I could spend another hour with many people. And I think that, how are you meant to look under all the rocks if you just don't have the time allocated? It's very, very difficult.
Yeah. And I also think with this woman, I always go most conservative to least conservative. So, with someone like her, I said, hey, let me watch you balance on one leg. She was holding her breath. Like, she did not want to accept load onto that leg. And at that point, are you going to take her through anything more advanced? You're saying, hey, let's have a conversation. You could take her through a step down and see how she does. But if she's not willing to even accept load, you're not going to want to watch her run. You're not going to want to have her take her through pogo jumps or single leg hopping, because who knows what could happen. So she ended up having a mid shaft femoral stress fracture, which is bizarre. That's the second one I've ever seen. But again, so when she walked in, I'm like, something doesn't make sense. And any time as a clinician that runs through your mind, you better really stop and start being very calculated with the questions that you're asking, so you can appropriately triage that person.
Well said, Chris. My own circumstances recently, I developed fairly quickly some non-specific thigh pain that you couldn't put a finger on, and I had been out for a 5-kilometre run Wednesday morning, just pushing the pace a little bit because I was pushing for time to get home, get the kids ready, and get to work. But by the time I walked into the house, Chris, I pulled up at 3.5K and walked the rest of the distance home. By the time I got to the practice to start work, I was considerably sore in my thigh, and by the time I got to the other end of the workday, I was hobbling and unable to pretty much weight bear. So my immediate thought was, having had a known femoral stress reaction years before, was I've got distinctly I've likely fractured this. It was so painful. And my mind was racing, knowing my bone status and also the other considerations, in someone that's otherwise fit and well, the things that no one would want, cancers, etc., and sarcomas. So I was pretty nervous when I went to have my MRI and somewhat relieved when it came back with, just a grade 3 stress reaction as opposed to the other nasties. So Chris, I think one of the things that people need to be aware of as well, I'm interested in your thoughts, is, and it's hard to get a gauge on, but the influence of genetics and, what we can't see beneath the surface of people that present. What is their bone status as they sit there? So can you speak to that in your practice? What do people need to be aware of in terms of their, potential genetic contribution? What might be important to look for?
Well, I think to just ask that question and to say, hey, and if for any reason, the family members are there, to engage them too and say, hey, look, at any point has it been brought to your attention that there could be a genetic predisposition to bone health? And perhaps this is something that is particularly important if you're speaking to females, but it should also be asked of males too. I think that a lot of these bone stress injury presentations, people forget that they often happen to males too. So, but I think there's so much that we just don't know at this point. I think that we're probably during our lifetimes, we'll start to learn more about some of the genetic considerations and predispositions. But you have to embrace this level of uncertainty and to say, like, hey, what else could be going on? This is a weird pattern. This person keeps getting hit with these bone stress injuries. Like if I'm thinking of your situation, I'm like, look here, here's a young fit guy. He's in the field. What else? Something else has to be going on. Like something's not ringing true.
You're listening to Chris Johnson on this, an expert edition on all things bone stress injuries. If you missed last week's episode, it was a featured performer episode featuring Australian distance runner on the rise, Ellie Pashley. Ellie herself is also a physiotherapist, and here's a little snippet of what you missed.
Sometimes you go in and you don't feel very good before a race and you don't feel very good when a race starts, but they can end up being some of your best races. So yeah, I've had a few of those as well, which is good because then you go into the next race and if you're not feeling that good, you don't let it worry you as much.
To tune into the full episode featuring Ellie Pashley, jump over to wherever it is that you enjoy your podcast from, and whilst there, be sure to peruse the archives, interest editions, expert editions, featured performers and interest editions dating right back to episode 1 featuring surf lifesaving Ironman champion Ali Day. For now, let's jump back on this expert edition with Chris Johnson on all things bone stress injuries for the endurance athlete. Yeah, I mean, I've started asking, is there a known history of osteoporosis in your family, in your lineage, your family tree? I mean, my father's father, Chris, was literally bent over at almost 90 degrees by the time he got to 80 years of age. And as a boy growing up, I was told that my granddad, was like that, bent over at 90 degrees because he worked hard on the railway, and therefore he wore his back out. That was the rationale. My father, who's always been an active guy, strong physical guy, he's now going that direction as well. And, knowing that there's obviously a genetic factor for the bone health of the males and maybe the females in my family that predisposes to some sort of mismatch between bone build-up and bone breakdown. So I think that's been useful just to explore people's family tree a little bit more for history of this.
And also realize that you may not go down that same path too. But yeah, I mean, these are really difficult conversations to have, especially if you're a practitioner working with someone who presents with a bone stress injury and they start telling you about this family history. it's obviously something that poses a significant threat to you. I can't imagine it wouldn't.
Yeah, I mean, fortunately, I went through a period of grieving, when I was diagnosed with poor bone health, because I think someone that values being physically active, that's the effect of an injury. There is that grief cycle that you do go through in accepting something. But beyond the acceptance, I've applied some consistent strength and conditioning work, and pleased to say that my 2-year follow-up bone density reported osteoporotic, now changed to osteopenic, so which was a real win and confidence boost. So it's certainly an area I'm passionate about, Chris, and look forward to unpacking the next phase with yourself and possibly your colleague Nathan on terms of how to manage these injuries. So this is another conversation, I believe, in and of itself, in how to manage it, return to run programs, the mistakes we make, the mistakes the athlete makes. So, Chris, anything you'd summarise on from your thoughts today before we do have that follow-up conversation, in terms of if there's someone out there listening who has a bone injury, what's their immediate best thing to do? A suspected bone injury, I should say. Bone stress injury?
Well, I think that you reach out to a practitioner who is known to have a specialization in that. So, and I'm sure that there are some great folks in Australia. I know in the U.S., you would reach out to like a Michael Fredrickson or an Adam Tenforty or Tenford. I'm not sure how you pronounce his last name, where this is their specific focus of research. And you consult them, and that may involve flying to Boston or to California. But I think that it's important, and you want to do due diligence with this. This is not something you want to just sort of haphazardly approach. Especially, if we're talking about an endurance athlete, and this is something that they're looking to participate in, or perhaps even compete in over the course of their life. And I think you want to be very proactive, and if you're a parent, to think about the things that you can do to promote good bone health. I said on a podcast, I forget who I was speaking with, but I said one of the greatest gifts that I can give my daughter is bone health. And that was a big reason why we actually moved out of New York City, is so she could be in a place where she can run around and play, and she's on her bike, and she's going to gymnastics, she plays soccer, she's dabbling in all this stuff, and including Stompy the bear. I think that engage people who this is what they do for a living, and probably you're going to need to take a team-based approach, so it may be a physician, it may be a nutritionist or an RD, it may be a good strength and conditioning specialist. But the tricky thing, and where all this stuff breaks down from my experience, is a communication, because all of these folks, if they're going to do this properly, have to take time out of their day, and they have a lot of people who are probably reaching out to them. So, you have to really be proactive and own it. And I think that, realize that bone is a tissue and it can adapt. And how do you create the right environment for that to happen across the board? And the things that you can take off the table easily, like sleep, nutrition, and basically consistent exercise, especially I think this is one of the perks of some of the heavy, slow resistance work, is these muscles are going to be tugging on bone, all right? And this is what we just learned from the I don't know how to pronounce this. Zellick is a lead author, but this was in Plus One in the early part of 2019, talking about ground reaction forces. But, heavy, slow resistance is going to load the musculotendinous unit, which has attachment points to bone. So that can be a great stimulus too.
Well said. And, I think the takeaway is there's a lot that can be done to better improve bone health, minimise hopefully the risk of bone stress injuries in the endurance athlete or the runner. So Chris, I look forward to next week furthering this two-part expert edition on all things bone stress injuries in the athlete, where we will deep dive into managing the bone stress injuries and also things like return to run programs. So Chris, thanks for your time today. In the meantime, where can folks jump on and find out more about everything that you're up to?
Oh, I've been pretty quiet lately, which is Well, I suppose so. I put up a decent amount of content on Instagram at ZarinPT. I have a website, ZarinPT.com. ChrisJohnsonPT.com is my personal website. And I'm pretty active on Facebook, though. Yeah, I'm largely doing things on the Runner Zone, which has been a fun community. I'll add you to that. Just because I just now realized that you're not a part of it. But it's an international, interdisciplinary group of practitioners who have a keen interest in endurance sports. And it's amazing. Like, I sometimes will have an athlete that is over in the UK or who is going to be relocating to England. I'm like, oh, go see Tom Goom or Matt Phillips. It's been this amazing network. And I don't advertise it a lot. I want it to just sort of grow organically. So that's the Runner Zone. I'm not on Twitter these days too much. I have such limited bandwidth, especially with the kids, and they see me on my phone enough. So, but yeah, I would say connect with me on Instagram. That's probably the best place, or Facebook. And, anything I can do to try and help you and sort of, open up doors that were open to me at one point, I'll gladly do so.
Chris, you've been very generous with your time, and you can now go and get that deep open water swim done this afternoon. So thank you for dropping by.
Yeah, awesome.
So there you have it, another episode of the Physical Performance Show, and I hope and I trust you took a lot from Chris's sharings today. If you did, then please reach out and let Chris know. You'll find Chris easily over on social media at ZarinPT. That's ZerenPT. You can also find Chris readily over online at ZarinPT.com. And be sure to check out the Runner's Zone podcast and also Chris's YouTube channel. Now, this is part 1 of this deep dive into bone stress injury management for the endurance athlete. So be sure to be tuning in next week for part 2, where Chris and his colleague, Kentucky-based US physical therapist Nathan Carlson of Running Mate, join me on a 3-way discussion on managing and rehabilitating bone stress injuries. A big thanks to those leaving ratings and reviews for the show. They really are a whole lot of fun to read. Massive thank you this week to show listener Sam, who rated the show 5 stars over on iTunes and commented, really enjoying this podcast, which features a wide variety of guests across different topics. The expert editions are the ones I enjoy the most, as I take so much out of it and I can put it into clinical practice. Shout out to recent guests Mick Hughes and Adam Meekins at nelson.sam.physio from Rockdale Physiotherapy and Sports Injury Centre. Thank you so much for that review, and it's great to hear fellow practitioners enjoying and learning from the expert editions. If you're enjoying the show and you'd like to make sure the show lands in your favourite podcast player each and every week, don't forget to hit subscribe. That is the best way to help the show grow. Keep the podsies coming. Also, they're a lot of fun. That's simply a screenshot of the episode that you're enjoying and tagging in the show on social media at Physical Performance Show. And you'll find me also at Brad_Beer on Instagram and Twitter. Huge thanks to the good folk who consistently make this show possible each week. That's Daryl Misson, our audio engineer, Susan Wilkin, all things show administration, Matthew Olding, all things graphic design, and Oliver Crossley assisting behind the scenes. Huge thank you once again to today's show sponsor, the fantastic physiotherapy-produced device, the Fasciitis Fighter. If you are a practitioner and you're yet to use the device with your patients or clients or athletes, be sure to jump over and check it out, fasciitisfighter.com.au. And if you are a sufferer of plantar fasciitis, or you know someone who is trying to get on top of it, such a pesky injury, then be sure to point them in the direction of the Fasciitis Fighter. As prior mentioned, coming up next week on the show, Chris Johnson joins forces with his colleague Nathan Carlson, and we continue this 2-part exploration of managing and rehabilitating bone stress injuries in the endurance athlete. There's a whole lot of learnings to be had. This show's about the highs, the lows, and the learnings, and we'll be bringing them next week. Here's a snippet of next week's expert edition.
One of the questions I love to ask runners is, especially, irrespective of what their presentation is, but what's the highest level activity that you have the utmost confidence in doing? So that way I start to get a lens into their willingness to load or their confidence in loading through that region. And I'll marry that with the physical performance test.
Until then, keep pursuing your physical best performance. I'm Brad Beer, and this has been the Physical Performance Show.